G'day legends, I hope that you're having a fantastic day and so far that you are having a fantastic week. Now, if we get interrupted in this video, I am right near my checkout time from this Airbnb before I drive up to Kansas City. So fingers crossed we can make it, because I do believe this video might be a little bit longer. But that's because in the end of this video, the main meat of the video is going to be going through an article, a study about changing victory and how Ukraine should seek strategic neutralization of Russia, and that will be the way to victory. And we're going to go through that. We're going to critique it, talk about what's good, what's bad, what we disagree with, the reality of then attrition on the battlefield as well. But I actually give my conclusion in the start of that, then we'll go through the article. So if you don't want to watch me go through the full article and the reaction to each individual point, I'll do the conclusion in the beginning to save you some time. Of course, we'll look at the maps, we'll look at a couple of geolocations, and we'll talk in the beginning. Where we'll start is with United States, drones, and weapons. Now, this gentleman here on Twitter, Vitali or Monsters, he has pointed out that we may be coming for a record drone strike in the next few days. And what he shows is in these graphs, the amount of drones then that are launched into Ukraine. And as you can see, that we have large spikes every, say, fourth or fifth day, and that we have had 3 days of relatively small strikes following here. Then we may see in the coming days very large drone attacks. We know Russia is focusing on mass, especially of those ground drones, and the production manufacturing is increasing as well, and we'll continue to see that cause a lot of chaos in the skies. Something we haven't looked at for some time is Urals crude. Of course, Russia, a fiscal economy, runs a lot of the oil price, and their budget did assume in the beginning a then $69-ish, then they lowered it down to an average of $56 for the year. And of course, this funds everything from pensions to the war. Of course, we're speaking about the war on this video. And what I will bring you is, once I'm home, I will link in with Dr. Connolly, our economist, and we'll do a full update on how the Russian economy is going. But of the 7th of July, you can see this is the Urals crude here. And of course, as I said, the budget is assuming an average now of $56. You can see it's at 64, and I've drawn in as close as I can a red line for around 56, so we can see that the average is definitely above that, and a yellow line at the original average price of the budget at the beginning of the year. Now, weapons, we know Ukraine is getting hammered night after night, especially from aerial targets, not only due to Russia's production of missiles and drones increasing, but also a huge decrease in the amount of weapons they have, defensive weapons, to be able to actually intercept these. And Trump has said this to Ukraine, that we're going to send more weapons. We have to. They have to be able to defend themselves. They're getting hit very hard now. They are getting hit very hard. We're going to have to send more weapons, defensive weapons primarily, but they are getting hit very hard. And what you'll see again and again in this is Trump talking about defensive weapons, and a lot of this is pointing at air defense. And people are celebrating this, but I say this isn't a good sign. A couple of sources here reported by Axios, but many are reporting this, that Trump has promised to immediately send 10 Patriot interceptors. That's very, very few. We see Patriot occasionally firing like a machine gun. That is, a few missiles that can intercept and try and find other means of supply. But of course, America is worried about its own stockpiles as well. And then if we go on to the DoD, their immediate release of this, Chief Pentagon spokesman Sean Parnell, he again says, sending additional defensive weapons to Ukraine to ensure Ukrainians can defend themselves while we work to secure a lasting peace and ensure the killing stops. So we're sending defensive weapons until we can get a lasting peace. See how the language has changed. Well, not it's changed, it's different between the US and where Europe may be on victory, on offensive victories on the battlefield, winning ground, to now we need to be able to defend until we can secure a peace. And we're going to go through what is the reality of this versus the rhetoric. Our framework for POTUS to evaluate military shipments across the globe remains in effect and is integral to our American first defence priorities. We know from Europe to the Middle East, a lot of, especially air defence interceptors, have been used over the past weeks and years, and the US is worried about how many they have. Why are they so worried about how many they have? Well, they're looking at other countries and where we may see flare-ups as well. And of course, America doesn't want to be left with their dick in their hand and nothing to intercept. Of course, a lot of the competition comes from China. Now let's have a quick look at the maps before we go through that article. So of course, here in the center of your screen is Ukraine, the capital of Kyiv. The red area is occupied since 22, the purple since 2014. Any red check that you will see on this map is ground that Russia has made over the last 24 hours. And again, today, relatively, we do have a large amount of updates. So let's come down into the south first. And day after day, we are seeing more ground made in the south. We saw, of course, Lubkove, Stepove come under Russian control yesterday, and today we see more movement in the direction of Kamyansk and moving through Plavny as well. Now, this should have been one of the easiest areas to defend with the waterway, with the defensive works in here, so any movement on the south tells us a lot about the situation. But this map may update further today because we do have this geolocation just out from Kamyansk. We do see Russian forces here with units and Russian national, Russian national flags as well, confirming then movement further out from Kamyansk. And of course, as I shared with you yesterday, many Ukrainian pages saying that Russia is pushing on many different axes in the south. And again, like I've said, if you are numerically superior, you want to thin out, you want to spread your enemy more thin across the long front line. And as I've said, this makes sense now to see Russia's movements in Sumy, in Kharkiv, and Kharkiv on the new axes as well. That you may not actually want to seize and hold ground here, but it's just to tie up more resources have to go there. So let's come up into the north and we'll look at Sumy. Of course, this is where Russia has crossed back. We have a couple of updates in here and where Ukraine has made an advancement. So let's firstly look at this right here. That. Zoom in just a little bit. This map isn't up to date in here. Since the first days of July, Ukraine army began counterattack around Kharkivka and managed to recapture some position along the road north of the locality. So this road in here, that Ukraine has made some positions back in here. Now we know this because there is geolocated footage of then Russian artillery landing all around this area. So if you're landing artillery somewhere, safe to assume that there is then opposing forces there. Now we'll come up Tyankyou, of course, Kursk Oblast, where Russia was almost surrounded at one point. We reported yesterday or maybe the day prior that on the eastern side of Tyankyou, the Russians had pushed Ukraine back to the border, and now, according to Syriac maps, the Russians have crossed into Sumy in this direction as well. I don't think the Russians will open up a new Sumy front here. I think this will just be to maintain what they have in Tyankyou and not have that risk of being surrounded again. So let's move our way down the map, have a look at the red check, and there is some significant parts on this, but nothing surprising. So finally, the Velika front around here has closed up. Now, for some time, I think it's highly likely that this has looked like this, but we are seeing this today. Komar, Perabudova is very likely under control, highly likely under control, but we have seen that this axis now has met on multiple different fronts, from the Velika front, from the Bahtar front. They have met, and this is exactly what we have been talking about for some weeks. You're going to see axes then transform into large kilometre squares, and I believe this month, next month, is when we're going to see this. And now you can see that this axis of Velika is really becoming the western flank of Pokrovsk, and this spells big issues once that widens, once it's very difficult to push back and you have a desaturation of your artillery and FPV systems as well. Let's have a look. Syriac maps, he shows then just more movement moving out to the west, captured Pidubny and south of Tolstoy, so south of Tolstoy and this area here, saying coming under control. We know there's at least movement in that direction. Then come up, we have then Pokrovsk, the western side of Pokrovsk. We often just refer to this as like Pokrovsk actual front. And then we have, during the last 3 days, Ukrainian army managed to re-enter the first houses of Novosohivkia. So just down in this area, there was a re-entry there. Of course, this map is still behind in Novomykolaiv on a minimum grey zone, but probably red due to the geolocations we have seen in there. And then on the eastern side of this, we do see further expansion to the east, as well as in Toretsk. Ignore Toretsk just for 1 second. We have on this map, again, we can see right in here, in the direction of Yamblanivkia, of course, the deep state is showing less eastern extreme movement than Syriac, but what we can take from this is we can confirm 100% that there was advancement in this direction. But he also shows that there has been a movement of the Ukrainian, possibly Ukrainian control, vague, in the north of this sector here as well, just down from Rusin Yar. Again, this map never showed that direction. And we can see as well, just to the north of Razine, there has been some advancement, at least by the Syriac maps as well. And then we'll come into Toretsk. You can see that there is some advancement in here, and the battle for Toretsk is really coming to an end. And this is why we use multiple maps, is we can confirm Syriac showing this, deep state showing this. It meets my threshold to say there was definitely an advancement in this direction. So that is the end of our mapping updates, but day after day we are seeing large gains being made, and I will endeavour to bring you an update on the kilometre squares we have this month so far, because we know by the 4th it was 100 square kilometres, which is a long way. People underestimate how much ground a lot of this is, because people either love to zoom right in or right out on the map. People zoom right out and go, oh, this is nothing. But if you zoom in, it can be a lot as well. And what I'll say is you need to at least apply the same standard. When Ukraine was making a few kilometres, maybe up to 8 or 10 kilometres in the 2023 counteroffensive, if you said that this is game-changing, that this is huge, but you're now ignoring this equivalent being made over then weeks in the Russian offensive at the moment, well, that shows a massive amount of biases. And people ask, will we see a complete collapse? Are we in the collapse, or is it going to continue grinding like this? Well, time will tell. But the attritional nature of warfare is, I think, the simplest nature of war to understand, but also the most misunderstood, not because people are not bright enough to understand it, because they don't want to apply the brutal realities and lessons that attritional war teaches us. So let's have a look at this. And this article here, Ukraine's new theory of victory should be strategic neutralization, by this non-resident scholar here. And this was for the Kanunji Institute, I believe. I'll go through the full thing later, but this is just my conclusion, present the conclusion, then I'll go through it to back up what I've come to here. Now, Ukraine's over-focused that the path to victory is a wonder weapon, a Wunderwaffen, instead of mass, is the reason the front looks like it does. Well, it's somewhat of the reason, and we have this obsession with technology and maneuver rather than we just need a lot of stuff. Now, yes, there's bits and pieces from this, but you're never going to just win a war of just having strategic assets, of just having long-range drones, or just having air defense, or just this. To seize and hold ground requires infantry and armor and mass, especially in an attritional nature of war. And a small number of high-end assets are just not going to have the effect that a large number of medium or low assets is going to in a war of this nature. This is ignoring the complete exhaustion that attritional war brings, and how resistance then can crumble. And this is why attritional war is effective and is the way to actually retain and take, seize and hold ground. Because by killing everything, you kill resistance, you kill appetite for war, all of that. It's a horrible, horrible nature of war. But by grinding forward slow, by people having the time to leave, or the people that remain either on your side or are then killed, that's the way a war like this works, that resistance will be minimal following. Okay, if Russia took these areas very quickly, if they were able to maneuver in and take these, the internal resistance would be completely impossible for them to retain these areas. This whole strategic neutralization, this is just a dressed up academic version, I guess, of attritional warfare. But it ignores that this is still a meat grinder, that Ukraine is bleeding resources and men just to try and stop and stabilize Russia from advancing. And Russia is still advancing, let alone to actually have victories and win back. And dressing this up in academic language doesn't change that reality. Like many, it fails to take into account that the Russian forces have been and are adapting, which in my opinion, at least tactical adaptation, they are faster at the moment in offensive capacity than Ukraine to adapt. We see Ukraine adapting more of the Russian tactics around motorcycles, around fiber optics, around other bits and pieces, turtle tanks, etc. We see more of that adaptation from Ukraine's taking from Russia than Russia taking to Ukraine at the moment. Now, calling these areas functional defeat as far as Navy and Air Force, this is delusional. Yes, there has been losses. It's not functional defeat. Russia's Black Sea Fleet, yes, it has repositioned, okay? Is it still firing missiles? Yes, all the time. They've adapted. They've had resistance, they've had large loss, they've adapted, still firing missiles. Same as the aircraft. And we see glide bombs by the hundreds are coming in every day. And if this is what we are calling victory, then the bar has been set dangerously low. And this is what I think a lot of this is trying to do, is just change that definition of victory and move those goalposts. What this doesn't take into account, again, for the factor of attrition, is it only takes into account Russian attrition. Not that there's barely enough troops left to hold positions, and these positions are not being held, let alone when we hear about Ukrainian soldiers talk about the inability to rotate or ever actually gain enough troops in one area to have like a large offensive. Russia, part of this is that they have a bigger population, they have a tighter grip on society, an easier time with recruitment, and time is on Russia's side. And you do not win long, bloody, costly wars without manpower. And the Ukrainian side, well, they're running out of it. As far as money, the EU, everyone is pledging money, but most of it is delayed or more symbolic than really having a battlefield effect. We see the US, especially under Trump, is backing off. And Ukraine's economy is default. It cannot carry this war or the weight of even their own nation without constant Western cash flowing in. And this, of course, is going to have, or we're already seeing, is having a shelf life. Sorry, let's open this. Now, it talks a lot about technology, around Ukraine using drones and artificial intelligence. Now, yes, but so is Russia. And Russia has factories pumping out cheap drones and cutting-edge electronic warfare. I think a lot of people fail to understand how worried a lot of nations are about Russia's electronic warfare. But tech, as we've gone over, it is not a silver bullet. Wars like this are still won by mass, supply, manpower. And NATO themselves say that Russia is outproducing NATO by 4 times. Now, if it's outproducing NATO by 4 times, that means it's outproducing what NATO can give to Ukraine probably by 10 times. Because if it's just outproducing on total, well, Russia can just move all that into the war. NATO has many other areas of which need to backfill before it can then go on to Ukraine. The idea that making the war pointless will force Putin back down and pull out, it's naive. It's something we've heard for a lot of time. This gentleman, he sees this war, this gentleman doesn't see how Putin sees that this is existential, and this war changed from an operation to achieve goals politically to an existential threat for Russia, and Putin sees it like this. So Putin, he's in no rush, and he will grind it out for as long as it takes. And a deadlock like this, it hurts Ukraine more than it hurts Moscow. Again, something we have heard for years, doesn't take into account things like emigration, people leaving Ukraine, and opportunity as well. Now, the steel porcupine that goes over, this is static defense fantasy. Basically, to build a fortress here that is untouchable. It sounds nice, but this again, it assumes that Russia never adapts and that static defenses will stop everything. And what this does is it then gives away initiative. And if you do adapt, you then mobilize the mass needed, you keep probing, then you break through, and you've given up the offensive initiative on the front line. Now, redefining victory as not losing is strategic despair. People aren't even talking about winning anymore. They're talking about surviving under fire for many, many years. And that's not a strategy. This is survival mode at best. And ask any Ukrainian soldier how sustainable this is. They'll tell you the real answer to this, not YouTubers. This isn't victory. This is trying to endure a slow bleed. And Ukraine, with catastrophic fertility rates, millions stuck in occupied territories, probably over 10 million that have left for Europe, who the longer this goes on will not come back, who are not having children, more lost in the front line. Again, this post-war attrition can be catastrophic as well. Now, our last conclusion here, that the theory here of ensuring that the war becomes operationally pointless, it doesn't match the front line. And in this article, this gentleman uses terms like meat wave or ghost of Kiev, and that is all that I really need to read to understand what lens this is seen through. But it just assumes that Ukrainians themselves will happily live in war forever. And this whole thing, it reads like a college war paper, but not a reflection of what is actually happening on the ground, and take into account these are actually humans who want to continue with their life and continue living and be prosperous as well. Not just, yep, okay, we understand we have to live for 2 decades in war. Its fancy concepts and innovation don't mean much when you are out of shells and the enemy, being Russia in this point, is assaulting every sector and having success. Yes, we see, yeah, this weapon's going to come in and change everything and this and that. And how many times have we been promised that Abrams and Leos and Charlies and F-16s are going to roll through things, when really what we see is, hey, instead of all of this for shells, maybe should have just, all of this for this tank should have just been shells. You need a mix of high and low, yeah, absolutely, but it can't just all be high-end equipment that's going to absolutely change things. And basically, it's my final conclusion of this, is it admits that there's no actual end game. It admits that peace isn't coming anytime soon, but still pretends that there is strategy. And what you're doing is you're looking at the situation and finding a strategy to accept that, rather than actually you develop a strategy and do actions to then meet that strategy. And we know there isn't really a strategy at the moment. People don't know what to do. So what you do is you move the goalposts. And what I've said is those goalposts have been put in the ground very, very firmly for what is victory. It's going to be very hard to try and get a society to accept that, given the cost that has been incurred. Now, what it describes is not a plan to win, but only a plan to survive indefinitely under fire and hope that Russia just then gives up. Again, it's not victory, it's a slow death PR campaign. It talks about strategic neutralization and resilience under pressure, like Ukraine can just hold the line forever, which isn't happening at the moment. But holding the line forever, it also assumes a never-ending supply of money, of manpower, of weapons, and public morale, with which none of these are unlimited. And the longer it goes on, will become worse and worse and worse, given the bankruptcy theory of attritional war. And especially given all the support here is coming from the West, who have democratic elections, and it can just be turned off, like we've seen with the US administration changing. As well, Ukraine's moving towards Germany. I know Germany's recently had an election, but still, and in the West, there is no further appetite for war. And what we know is Russia doesn't need to win in a conventional sense. It just needs to keep Ukraine in a permanent state of instability. And this instability will then mean that you can never get enough together for NATO entry, for other bits and pieces, and push back on the ground too. That's why we've said the goal posts for Russia are actually easier to achieve and less of a line in the sand than for Ukraine. And a lot of it, if Ukraine doesn't walk away with 1991 borders and NATO, many people will see this as a failure. Now, in my opinion, I've pushed back on that from day one, saying if Ukraine can survive in any capacity, I'd see that as a large win. But Russia's goal in this is to then keep in a permanent state of instability, which drains Ukrainian population. It wrecks the Ukrainian economy while attriting their own as well. But of course, there's been a large movement of economic reliance to China and wait out the West. It's just to hold and wait, and yeah, you'll get tired eventually, which we are seeing happens. And eventually the whole framework starts to collapse. And this is admitting that there's no real off-ramp here. There's no trigger that ends the war on Ukraine's terms. There's just a vague hope that eventually, after years of bloodshed, that Russia will reconsider by increasing the cost and, as he would say, making it operationally pointless. But what this admits is that there is no defined path to close off this war, that you're not in control, that you're just reactive to what the other side is doing, giving up that initiative too. And what this is doing is reacting to the reality with language that softens the blow and paints it in a more positive light, as we see everywhere. Calling endless war sustainable resistance and rebranding stalemate as a functional success. So again, it's creating that pseudo-environment where that is true. But the truth is, if this war drags out for another 5 years, it is not Russia that breaks first, it's Ukraine. Okay, so let's actually then go through this article. Let me check the time. Okay, let's try and smash through this because I'm well beyond my checkout time. So now you may actually understand what this is about. Ukraine's new theory of victory should be strategic neutralization. By ensuring that Russia's war is operationally pointless, Ukraine can survive, adapt, and achieve success, no matter how prolonged the war. That is the title. Russia's war against Ukraine has entered a new phase, defined not by momentum or negotiation, but by strategic deadlock and ideological persistence. Despite the failure of its early campaign, Russia shows no intention of ending the war. On the contrary, the Kremlin is preparing for a prolonged confrontation with additional offensives. They've been preparing for this ever since mid-2022, when I believe the Russian command accepted that this is going to be attritional. Okay, we've failed on the maneuver aspect here. We haven't had that ease maneuver as well as lack of resistance that we expected, like we saw back in 14. Right, this is going to be attritional. This is what we need to do. And growing external partnerships, particularly with China, Western fatigue, along with the West's apparent lack of will or ability, coerce it into peace. And that this is what they're relying on to extend that war. And as I said, if it goes for another few years, there's not in Ukraine's favour. Recent expectations, particularly in Washington, that a ceasefire could soon be negotiated have proven premature, if not an outright miscalculation. Many Western policymakers have constructed a long-term strategy for Ukraine based on the assumption that once hostilities end, it can be fortified through a combination of indigenous production and target external support to deter renewed aggression. And this is why Putin wants to keep that pressure on. But why this is a massive miscalculation is Putin can now smell blood in the water of if the answer to the question of will Russia be in a better battlefield position in 3 or 6 months, if your answer to that is yes, with all the calculations of attritional war that I'm looking at, the answer is yes, in my opinion, then it's going to be very, very hard to bring in a ceasefire given the situation at the moment, if you can just extend and be in a better position or demand more in that time. But what if hostilities do not end? In that case, a strategy based purely on deterrence is not sufficient. Rather than assuming a war can be ended through a comprehensive battlefield victory and negotiated compromise, Ukraine and its allies must plan to build a viable, sovereign and secure state under constant military pressure. So see where this isn't synonymous with itself, that you're viable, sovereign, secure, but under constant fire too. And this reality demands a redefinition of what a successful outcome looks like. It's a large redefinition though. You're asking Ukrainians to, okay, no, a successful outcome is you remain in a battlefield with drones in the air and all of this. In this context, the objective should not be to defeat Russia outright or to expect its regime to end the war because of economic or diplomatic pressure, but to systemically deny it the ability to achieve its military goals. Again, this doesn't take into account how attritional warfare works and the post-war attrition, or even just attrition not only on the front line, but people leaving the state as well. And if the war ends in the situation and goes, yep, but we're not joining the EU, not joining NATO, and there's still going to be constant pressure, all those that have fled to Europe, the EU, they're not coming back, or a lot won't come back. And once those borders open, that men 18 to 60 can leave, strap in as well. The steel porcupine strategy, what we hear about a lot. Kyiv and many of its partners in Europe have viewed a negotiated ceasefire as unlikely, so long as Russia has shown no willingness to compromise on its core demands, namely to render Ukraine defenceless and unable to seek external support from the West. So it doesn't want Ukraine in NATO, and it wants to walk away with those 4 oblasts. Central to this planning has been the idea of turning Ukraine into a steel porcupine, a country so defensively fortified that any future Russian offensive would fail by design. What this doesn't take into account is how much resource and manpower you'd need to do this as well, but it also, you're sitting just static, it gives up initiative as well. The goal is to build a system of deterrence by denial, in which Ukraine's strength and readiness, and not formal alliances, are the first line of defence. So it's not that we're in NATO, it's that we're so fortified you can't move through anywhere. Europe has emerged as the chief enabler of this strategy. The European Union and its member states, as well as the UK and Norway, have committed billions of euros to Ukrainian defence manufacturing, including production and logistical support, building capacity to defend itself independently. But again, this is the problem, is people talk about Ukraine's need, even following the war, to have a 1 million man army in a country that is very, very small. It's how then are you running factories if you're a constant state of war? A reality check, no end in sight. That Russia is not preparing to end the war. On the contrary, it's positioning itself for a prolonged confrontation. It positioned itself for this years ago. Despite West, it's just clear now, but it absolutely, look back, it was clear in 22 this occurred. The doctrine of attritional warfare tells us this too. Despite Western hopes for a negotiated ceasefire, Moscow's posture and rhetoric, including declarations to fight forever, reflect a regime that sees time as an advantage, not a constraint, which time is an advantage for Russia. This misalignment stems largely from a persistent Western rationality bias. The belief that Russia too must act according to a cost-benefit logic that follows the West's own analysis. So saying that the West is acting rationally and that Putin is acting irrationally. We'll talk about more of this. That is shaped by the belief for Putin that this is existential for both Russia and his regime, and by ideological conviction that Ukraine must be subjugated once and for all. The war is no longer a campaign. It is structural foundation on Putin's system, absorbing a vast share of state resources and driving the elite patronage networks. Now, this irrationality versus rationality. People would love for you to believe this, and people will push this more and more and more. Putin, love him, hate him, whether you believe he's a war criminal or a hero, whatever, I don't care. He's very, very calculated, especially on Russia's world order. And Russia fights war differently. And I think Kissinger put it together well when he said Russia fights with the discipline of Europe, but with tyranny of Asia. And yeah, Russia fight attritional warfare differently. And part of this, and we've seen through Soviet doctrine, we've seen how the Russians have fought historically and the Soviets, etc. And even now, is the exception of huge loss and the mass of low-end army as well. But this is set to fight a war like this when there's huge amounts of loss and huge amount of mass, because you can replace that more easily. But given the outcome of attritional war, with what you want is complete exhaustion, as I said, you kill everything and everyone on the way, it is not irrational if we look objective, you take out any emotion, and of course that's a horrible thing. You take out that is not an irrational objective tactic. That no, we just grind, and that there's no resistance then left behind the line, and we stop it off there. That we're attriting everything. Now, the war has changed in somewhat, at least amongst some of the Russian elite, from a battle against NATO expansion to a battle against modernity and a battle for keeping Russia in the way that it is now and fighting back in a existential way to Western expansion, or almost, as some would say from the Russian elites, Western woke imperialism as well. That no, we are fighting for our ideology, not to influence the political decision of NATO. Putin's bet on achieving a comprehensive victory in Ukraine is likely further reinforced by growing strategic partnerships with China, reduce the perceived impact of Western sanctions, embolden, of course, you're selling stuff to one of the major players on the global stage. The Western sanctions are not having the effect that people thought they would. Notably, its reluctance to strengthen sanctions or provide significant additional pressure to Ukraine from the US, because I think that someone like Trump, who is more of a realist leader, is going, well, this isn't working. We can't just keep doing the same tactic again and again. Likely strengthen Putin's belief that Western pressure will not intensify meaningfully as time goes on. For him, it's not a pause, it's an opening. And again, this is not irrational. It is completely rational for Putin to go and observe what is happening and going, do you believe that Western pressure will intensify meaningfully? Most people's answer to that would be no. And therefore, it's not irrational for Putin to go, we just hold on, and things will improve on our side. Moreover, Putin may believe better opportunities lie ahead. Yes, a tired Ukraine, a divided West, and a restrained US suggest that time is on his side. He is gambling that prolonging the war will deliver more than settling it now. And the gamble is not irrational from his point of view. Any strategy going forward must begin with this reality, that Russia is not seeking an exit, and Putin does not feel compelled to negotiate. Without significant external pressure or internal disruption, he will likely continue the war indefinitely by adapting, manoeuvring, and absorbing losses in pursuit of objectives that remain unchanged. And the objectives, not only are remaining unchanged, they may actually increase in their nature as well. Ukraine's allies now face a unique challenge: an autocrat willing to sustain conflict for years, supported by a war-adapted economy, internal repression, and growing partnership with China. And this is what Trump is scared of, because China benefits greatly from this and is far more of a threat than Russia. That, hey, what happens if we just continue this for years? Traditional deterrence, meant to prevent aggression by threatening unacceptable consequences, no longer functions in this context. Putin is already committed to the war, views it as existential, and is prepared to absorb costs that would dissuade actors with limited aims. And this is what I've been saying since about 2023, is once this war became existential for Putin, not just a political goal of we want this or NATO, it became existential, that Putin and in many ways in his nation only will survive or die based on this existential. Everything changed of the losses that they'd be willing to take, the actions of what they'd be willing to take, and that in 22, maybe very, very early 23, it wasn't yet existential for the Russian state. And this is when there would have been option, it's hindsight's the foresight of arseholes, but there would have been option to negotiate on significantly better terms, or even a deployment of some level of NATO force to push back as well. If it is impossible to dissuade Putin, then the question is how to systemically obstruct his efforts. Ukraine's strategy must now shift from trying to deter future attacks to actively preventing Russian operational success, no matter how long the war continues, but at what cost as well, because it doesn't take into account the amount of men this is going to need, and you're asking a population to just go through forever war, the attritional strategy dilemma. In the early phases of full-scale war, Ukraine and its partners envisioned a path to victory grounded in decisive manoeuvre, large-scale counteroffensives that would break Russian lines, retake occupied territory swiftly, and shift the war's trajectory in Kyiv's favour. The reason why is because any real analyst knew if you get stuck in an attritional war here, you won't win. You need to reintroduce, and maintain manoeuvre in the battlefield to have any victories here. These expectations culminated in the 2023 offensive, supported by extensive Western training and equipment. The best military Ukraine was going to conjure up and will conjure up during the war was right then, and it did fail. It failed spectacularly when we look back. Personnel exhaustion, ammunition shortages, challenges for Ukrainian forces to conduct complex synchronized operations, slow and fragmented Western decision-making, and critically, the transformation of the battlefield through drones, mines, and layered fortifications exposed the limits of this approach. It became clear that a quick breakthrough was not achievable under these conditions. In response, Ukraine transitioned to a strategy of defensive attrition, one that leverages drones, artillery, remote mining, distributed operations to inflict steady losses on the Russian forces. This played to Ukraine's comparative advantages: tactical innovation, technological ability, and ability to conserve manpower. Now, I vehemently disagree with this. Throughout 24 and 25, the strategy has helped stall Russian advances. No, it hasn't. Deny Russian operational momentum. No, it hasn't. And stabilise the front lines. No, it hasn't. Russia has not been able to achieve a strategic breakthrough despite its numerical and resource superiority. It depends what we call a strategic breakthrough. But Ukraine may have done this in some areas of the strategy of defensive attrition, but definitely not overall. Ukraine is not having a steady withdrawal back and not getting enveloped in areas to try and increase Russia's attrition. Look at Avdiivka, look at Bakhmut, look at the Pokrovsk, at the sector. All of this, again and again and again, we see areas get enveloped, large amount of forces. It's assuming that Russia is only going for kilometre squares, that they are not trying to increase Ukraine's attrition either. Now, tactical innovation, again, technological adaptability, these are areas in which I do not believe at the present moment that Ukraine is ahead in many ways, and to artillery, just all of this. That there's this idea that Ukraine is pulling back systemically to increase losses. Now, that is what likely should be happening, but as I've said, Ukraine is in a territorial war in this. That they have territorial, so does Russia. Russia has a territorial ambition that they believe they'll take through attrition, where Ukraine has territorial ambition that they believe they will take through offensive action. And that is the difference in this. And this is why we see Ukraine holding on to the very last minute of any of these sectors, even if objectively, for attrition rate, should have pulled out. Bakhmut, Avdiivka, Velika Novosibirsk, again and again and again. Listen to actual soldiers in this, not just something like this. But it's wrong to label the war a stalemate. Even though Russia has been unable to so far achieve any decisive breakthroughs, the battlefield remains highly dynamic. It depends what we call a breakthrough, but making 3 to 4 kilometres a day steadily on many different sectors, you may not be an armoured, mobilised breakthrough, which some would expect, but it is significant. And again, this is all assuming that Russia isn't focused on Ukrainian attrition. Look at Turn E. Look at what I've been talking about there. As I said, Russia will not move any further west of this area to hold the flanks, cut off all of this, create fatal funnels, and focus on attrition. Attrition by itself is not a long-term strategy. It's a holding pattern. Sort of. It's a holding pattern until you have breakthrough. It has prevented Ukraine's collapse and frustrated Russian objectives. But over the long term, this type of warfare holds significant risk for Ukraine. It will erode troop morale, zap Ukraine's economic and industrial resources, and exhaust Western patience. But what this is asking for is Ukraine to step into just a never-ending attritional cycle. Russia is already adapting, mobilising new personnel, regenerating equipment stocks, and redefining its drone and strike capabilities. Therefore, Ukraine requires a strategic shift, not a wholesale rejection of attrition, but an integration of a broader, more proactive plan. Ukraine and its allies must confront the reality that traditional definitions of endgame may no longer apply. Move those goalposts. The idea of a clear military outcome now appears increasingly remote. For example, by this centre, puts the odds of South Korea-style armistice at 15%, reflecting how unlikely a formal cessation of hostilities is under the current conditions. Given the Kremlin's maximalist goals, domestic control and ideological framing of the war, it is possible the conflict may not technically end at all, not least while the Russian regime remains in power. Now, this is the problem, is, well, then how are you going to enter into these areas of economic or military stability for Ukraine? You're asking the population there to stick it out and, yep, okay, just be forever war. Under such circumstances, a revised theory of victory must be grounded in realism rather than closure, okay? Victory for Ukraine may not come through peace negotiations or battlefield capitulation, but through a construction of a resilient, secure and thriving state under a permanent threat. Again, this doesn't take into account the attrition that has already occurred and post-war attrition, people that can then leave as well. It's a lot easier for a young Ukrainian couple to leave into Europe than it is for South Koreans. This means normalising national life, rebuilding the economy, maintaining a viable defence posture and ensuring that Russia attempts to disrupt Ukrainian sovereignty are strategically ineffective. It means persuading allies to support Ukraine, not just until peace, but through a sustained period of resistance during which the war continues, but Russia repeatedly fails to achieve its goals. In this light, Ukraine's strategic objective would not be to end the war on ideal terms, but to functionally nullify Russia's war aims by building a successful nation under pressure. The question is, but then what? Okay, let's say the front stops and it's under pressure. What happens in 10 years? Then do you mount an offensive to try and take this back? What is the actual end game rather than just living under that constant pressure? Strategic neutralization. If Ukraine's theory of victory rests not on the war ending, but on functionally defeating Russia's objectives while building a resilient, secure and sovereign state, then a new strategic framework is required. One that I'll refer to as strategic neutralization, the approach designed to make Russian aggression across all domains operationally incapable of disrupting key aspects of Ukrainian strategic, political, economic and social life, academic rebranding of attrition. It is not premised on compelling Russia to negotiate or exhausting its resources through attrition alone, instead to paralyse Russia's ability to achieve any military success at all by making it, nullifying, neutralising this. It recognises that functional defeat, where a military capability is not completely destroyed but rendering it irrelevant, is both a repeatable and scalable output that Ukraine has already achieved in multiple cases. The cases he brings up is air and navy, which, as I said in the conclusion, is delusional to call that it is irrelevant, okay? It's go speak to someone with a Fab 3000 dropped on their head or a missile fired out of a Navy ship. Unlike traditional attrition, which aims to wear down enemy forces through sustained losses, neutralization focuses on denying function rather than depleting volume. Again, it's just clever rebranding. Attrition demands constant material and human sacrifice to maintain pressure. By contrast, neutralization aims to disable or render ineffective key operational systems, often with far lower costs. The goal is to render unusable specific high-value functions, logistics, coordination, mobility, and fire support. For example, rather than to eliminate every soldier or vehicle, the framework would allow Ukraine to conserve manpower and sustain resistance over time. So again, going on that high-end stuff is going to then reduce the need for manpower and maneuver, which again and again and again we have seen as the goal over years, but has never really ended up exactly like that. Now, I'm going to just click pause here. I'm going to go to Kansas, and the next part of the video from number 10 on, I'm going to be in a different city because I need to get on the road. Right, I'll speak to you in a minute. G'day legends, welcome back. I'm now in Kansas City. Had about a 5-hour drive, but we're going to continue. We've got several more slides of strategic neutralization to talk about. I know this video is getting a bit long in the tooth, but well, you're probably used to it on this channel. So, well, you're probably more up to date actually with what I am because this is just going to be edited in. So, functional defeat as an operational objective. Functional defeat is the building block of strategic neutralization in domain after domain, the Black Sea, the air, the cyberspace, and any informational domain. It's increasingly on land. Russia has been forced into a position where it cannot use its superior assets to deliver results. Now, they may not be delivering them as people had predicted, but at the end of the day, aerial assets, naval assets are still delivering, maybe different, but it is still there. These defeats are not symbolic, they're operational. Each instance of a domain-specific functional defeat degrades Russia's campaign and weakens its strategic leverage. The strategic leverage, though, is still land warfare. This is still a land war, and the largest leverage is still then troops on the ground, and it will be won or lost on the ground, given that it is a ground war. Cross-domain operational paralysis. Strategic neutralization requires sustained efforts to paralyze Russia's capabilities across all domains. Air, land, sea, cyber, information simultaneously. This is not attrition in the classic sense, but a denial of function. It must be made incapable of conducting large-scale offensives. So you need to deny everything here that they can't then actually conduct large-scale offensives. But what we have seen is Russia in 2025 has more capacity than in 23 and 24 to conduct large-scale offensives. And that movement, from paralysis to now what we're seeing, that is very dangerous exploitation of what is happening on the battlefield that we have seen. Asymmetric pressure and strategic patience. Because strategic neutralization does not require full liberation or formal resolution, it enables Ukraine and its partners to act asymmetrically and sustainably. It is a strategy of smart pressure and long game resilience, not frontal sacrifice. While Russia pursues large, slow, resource-intensive offensives with diminishing returns, that I disagree with. I think they are having an easier time the longer the war goes on, and it's not just me thinking this. The data shows this. At least the data we have that we showed you, it's got to be probably 3 weeks ago, that showed vehicles lost versus kilometre squares gained. Ukraine uses cheaper, high-impact tools to destroy, disrupt, delay, and deny. Incorrect. The tools Ukraine uses, from 155mm through to Leopards and Charlies, through to F-16s, etc., they use more expensive, lower mass, and you could say higher quality. That's fine. But as far as saying that Ukraine uses cheaper, high-end tools, that is incorrect. The Soviets through to the Russians, they are known for lower quality, more mass. Look from World War II is a great example of this, being that Ukraine's reliant on now on Western equipment. Now, in this, people go, well, what about drones? Yeah, well, that's not exclusively to Ukraine. It asymmetrically favours the defender as long as endurance is matched with innovation and support. Yes, but the whole point that I'm getting to in this article is that then you're asking the whole population to deal with a decade or more of conflict, and I just don't know if the appetite is there for that long. And even at the end of it, there's no guarantee at all. Erosion of strategic legitimacy and perceived effectiveness. Even autocracies, perception matters. Strategic neutralization works not only on the battlefield, but also in the minds of Russian elites and security institutions. Repeated failure to achieve military effects, despite massive investments, fuels doubt and disillusionment. Strategic neutralization should be paired with informational operations to highlight these failures, erode confidence in Russian command, and challenge the internal narratives of progress and strength. While this may not produce rapid unrest, it could build internal friction over time. And many were predicting that this is what would occur in that very beginning, when assets were frozen, when sanctions hit, etc., that there would be internal friction. The thing is with this, though, is it's going to increase slowly and then rapidly and then start decreasing over time. That's how sanctions work. They hit slow because you've got to then run out of like your cash flow, and then you've got to adapt to the sanctions, which is when it's worse. But after time, they start going off. And the high point of sanctions, in my opinion, has been passed, because now, well, it's just flipped over onto China or selling to other markets. And the longer that sanctions are in place, especially with the fiscal economy, the less that they will actually work over time. And everything should have gone in day one, but there's a lot of reasons of why that may not have occurred as well. So again, potentially, but it's something we've been hearing for a long time. Contesting the skies, Russia's constraints in the air domain. He talks about operational spiderweb here of the drones taking out, say, a dozen bombers. And what we have seen is, he says, large platforms become liabilities. It's challenging to demonstrate a functional defeat in the air domain when Ukrainians continue to endure record waves of missile and drone attacks. So these are continuing too. But what I will say is the operational spiderweb took out a dozen fighters, dozen bombers. What we've seen, though, is these bombers used less and less, and the aircraft that are impacting just the very front line, none of them were touched. That's Su-34, Su-35, Su-25, and this was a 12-month or more operation that had a lot of resource put into it. You're not going to be able to just continue this again and again. And that's what we've spoken about, is operations need to be simultaneous and successive. And I am surprised to have not seen successive and simultaneous operations occur after this to actually exploit on that. And he does say that the front, they still are having Russian daily attacks from things like glide bombs, which are catastrophic. As damaging as it is, the fundamentally different from what might have occurred if Russia had succeeded in establishing air dominance. Yes, as challenging as it is, if Russia had air superiority, it would be a significantly different front line if they had things like close air support. Preventing this outcome remains one of Ukraine's most critical early achievements. That is correct. Although we can't, You can't speak before this is over, because you could see more and more air superiority. And what I am saying is, if you had a sliding scale, I think Russia's got more freedom in the air now than it did a few years ago. Russia's long-range strikes continue to cause extreme damage to critical infrastructure, civ targets, dual-use industry. The air domain remains highly contested. The air domain in Ukraine's borders or outside of that territory remains, yes, contested. But these strikes, they don't need to be within that as well. With the glide bombs being out to 130 kilometres now, most can operate within a 30 or 40 kilometre range, remaining well over the protection of friendly air defence to the Russian forces. And if you want data on this, just when was the last time we actually saw a fighter aircraft or fighter bomber taken down out of the air? Ukraine's allies must find ways to contest Russia's air capabilities more effectively. Yes, I agree with that. The biggest thing that Ukraine and partners need to do is somehow get those Su-34s out of the sky. Those glide bombs are working just as catastrophically massive artillery. It's working as 250 kilogram to 3,000 kilogram artillery flying dozens of kilometres. Strikes on Russian airfields must be prioritised, rendering them redundant and incapable of launching jets and bombers. Airfields can be fixed very, very quickly. Again, Ukraine still gets fighter jets up in the air, and Russia has had the long-range missile capability for years. Ukraine desperately needs more spiderweb-type operations. Again, these take a long time. Russia lacks production capacity to replace aging strategic bombers. No. If the Kremlin really wanted to, UAC Tupolev could produce a long-range strategic bomber. Why does no country actually operate anymore, or create, I should say? Countries operate long-range strategic bombers. That's incorrect. Of course, they still do operate them. But why are no countries building these? Okay, why is no one building B-1Bs, Tu-160s, aircraft like that? Because they are becoming redundant. Now, they're not redundant at the moment. It is cheaper to get a cruise missile off one of those than a ballistic missile from somewhere else. But there's a reason why we are moving away from that to more smaller multi-role and stealth aircraft. And we say functional defeat in air domain is difficult but possible, proven as the ghost of Kyiv. Okay, sure. Let's continue on this. Precision kill zones, Russia's functional paralysis in the land domain. A very peculiar, though still extremely dangerous situation has taken place in the ground. Although Russia has committed enormous manpower, estimated at nearly 500,000 troops deployed in Ukraine on a regular basis, and dedicated 40% of national public spending to the war effort and related security costs, sure, Russia's forces have made no strategically meaningful territorial gains over the past year. Now, again, this is dependent, I guess, on how you measure it. Has there been significant ground made? Yes. Will the gains in attrition start translating into strategic territorial gains? Yeah, they have. Strategically meaningful ground, pushing Ukraine back out of Kursk is significant. Flanks of Pokrovsk, once that comes under control, then used as a hub to expand out into Kramatorsk, Slovyansk areas. Important. Again, this is it's bricks in a wall, okay? It's tactical bricks in the wall, and as I've said, and as the maps going to show, you will start to see more of this. One of the key reasons for this paralysis has been Ukraine's innovative use of small drones and precision-guided munitions to create a persistent adaptive kill zone extending at least 20 kilometres in depth across the front. Yeah, who do we hear more talking about these envelopments, kill zones being created? Who do we hear talking about that way more? Look on yesterday's video is Ukraine. Ukraine getting constantly enveloped and being surrounded on multiple sides, and the depth of these drones, from small drones to Lancet to now Garand in a tactical sense, absolutely overmatching artillery, both barrel glide and drone as well. And this idea that there's Ukraine focusing purely on attrition while Russia's focusing purely on territory, I think this guy actually has it the exact opposite of what I'm seeing on the front line. And the best example of this anywhere is exactly what I predicted what would occur on the Terney front, is that the Russians would just push to the west of here around Ridkadub, leave this open and create a kill zone the whole way in here, and we've seen this again and again. Why do you think on so many flanks the Russians are choosing to not push in the center and hold on the flanks of areas? Push up, extend, and push up and extend. I think there's applying logic, but almost in the opposite way. Ukraine's goals are territorial. Russia's goals are attritional, and influencing politics through attritional war means to influence entry into NATO or influence territorial, but through the attritional nature of the war. The result is not the total defeat of Russian ground forces, but the functional disablement of traditional land warfare doctrines. No, the land warfare doctrine of attritional war is absolute. Like, go back and watch some videos of mine in 22, 23, and it's like literally they're ticking off boxes. Its classical Operation Ground Forces warfighting methods include mass firepower or Russian-style human wave attacks no longer produce the results in such an environment. Human waves attacks have not been occurring in this. I guess any platoon or section attack technically is a human wave attack, but again, this language is used to set the pseudo-propaganda environment to make out like a World War I, blow the whistle, over the top boys on your fucking horses into battle with a bayonet on. That isn't what is happening, okay? And you can scream and chant orc all you want, but if you look at the larger strategic and tactical picture, Russia's had huge failures. Yes, it's taken a slow time to adapt, but is there method to the madness on the battlefield at the moment? Yes, there is. What emerges instead is a new battlefield reality in which mobility equals vulnerability and mass becomes liability rather than an advantage. You can either have, it's not one or the other. Mobility can equal vulnerability. But mobility, smaller units, if that is vulnerability, then what you want to achieve is mass. While Russia continues to adapt and experiment, the current configuration of its land campaign, built on doctrines of armoured assault and concentrated fire, is to a large extent proving operationally inert under constraint disruption from dispersed, lower cost and more agile Ukrainian systems. Not really. The way we're seeing the frontline work is what Russia is doing is exploiting their advantage of having larger numbers to lengthen the front line. So yes, if there is dispersed, lower cost, more agile systems, to lengthen that out. But as far as, is there a huge advantage on who on this battlefield has more dispersed, lower cost, agile systems, such as drones? No, in the past 12 months, Russia has either had parity or advantage in the drone space. I'd say advantage with the fibre optics over the time. That it's a bit like there's no replacement for displacement when you're talking about a V8. It's a bit the same in attritional warfare with mass. Still, Russia's ground forces are launching dozens of small unit assaults daily. Didn't you talk about low-cost, dispersed, agile units? Backed by airstrikes, drone innovations, and persistent efforts to find breaches in Ukraine's defence architecture, which is being found. The functional disruption achieved on ground is so far from complete. It is constantly improved and actively sustained, as even limited degradation or stagnation of Ukraine's defence innovation could open space for Russian breakthroughs. Yes, and I think there has been a stagnation, especially in like 22, 23, and that Russia seized that an innovative advantage too, and that's what we're seeing translate down the line. Ground denial, like other forms of strategic containment, is a moving target, not a fixed line. At the moment, Ukraine has achieved partial success in the ground domain, showing that disruption is possible, even if functional defeat is still a distant prospect. The land has not stabilised. It is not only is it coming under Russian control, it's coming under Russian control at a faster rate, at lower losses from the best data that we have available. Winning the military technology race. Perhaps the most decisive factor in neutralising Russia's warfighting potential will be Ukraine's ability to win the military technological innovation race and to scale successful solutions faster than Russia can. Now, so far, we have not seen this. Unmanned, AI, digital battle management. Again, we have not seen a huge this in that. And these are going to be more effective if you have maneuver in the battlefield. When you don't have maneuver in the battlefield, digital battle management, bits and pieces like this aren't as much an advantage. It is an advantage, but not as much. Yeah, battle management systems more effective in a more asymmetrical style warfare. I was a battle management operator. The system fucking sucked that we used, but either way, the scale and pace of change suggests there is a new military technological revolution underway, and one that should reshape the character of war. Like I said in my conclusion, it's like the only ones seeking technological advancement is Ukraine in this, which it is absolutely not. But none of this is ever going to replace mass. It makes it easier. It is a battlefield. It increases the cost on the battlefield, but no technology yet, and we're not having robots on the battlefield, we're not having Terminator out there, nothing like that can seize and hold ground. You still need people for that. This creates a unique opportunity for Ukraine. If the war becomes locked in conventional dynamics, which it is, Ukraine's path to victory will narrow. But by leading in military innovation, Ukraine can offset traditional disadvantages and impose disproportionate costs on Russia. This is what is being said for the last 3.5 years, but has not yet come to fruition because the Russian tech is advancing as far as anything else on the battlefield. But Russia also recognizes the stakes and is investing heavily to win this race, likely working with China as well. Ukraine's advantage lies in its people, including an agile and creative tech sector that has already turned the country into a hub for battlefield innovation. But that innovation needs to turn into mass. And the thing is, with any of this tech on the battlefield is somewhat overrated, because we know everything has a very long time before it actually enters the battlefield and a very short time that technology is actually effective on the battlefield. Now, tech on the battlefield at the moment, from speaking to people behind the scenes and publicly as well, has about a 6-week effective window. We saw this with the Excalibur shell. We see this with many other bits of equipment. It's about 6 weeks until there's a counter, and then it's back to the drawing board. And this is why mass is still so important. And of course, that sort of stuff is far more expensive and far more complex. At its core, strategic neutralization seeks to create cross-domain operational paralysis. Russia may continue to fight, but its forces will fail to achieve their objectives, and strategic capabilities will systematically disrupt it. Ukraine will not need to win by conventional definitions, but rather ensure that Russia can no longer impose outcomes on the war. So increase that cost and rely on them losing rather than Ukraine winning. Strategic neutralization will require more adaptive, capable, and forward-looking force. But at the end of the day, it doesn't matter how good your rifle is if the magazine is empty. And that's what I say about tech. Strategic neutralization is not a peace plan, but a strategy for sustained resistance and long-term success under conditions of permanent hostility. It offers a way to survive, adapt, and prevail without illusions by ensuring that Russia's war effort, no matter how prolonged, remains operationally pointless. If Russia cannot win, its leaders will eventually have to ask whether it's worth continue fighting. And that's where Ukraine's theory of victory begins. But also, is that not going to be asked on the other side? That if we cannot win, is it worth it? And that's going to be the question which will be asked in time is, hang on, so you're asking for us to live under permanent hostility, to survive and adapt and prevail under this? Is it worth continuing fighting as well? Again, these are going to be questions asked, and there has to be at what cost asked as well. That, okay, we may be able to extend this, but we're going to have 10 more million people leave the nation. We're going to have every male on the front line fighting or holding a trench. At what cost to the state do we imply on the people? The last bit. Strategic neutralization will not be a static condition but a dynamic contest. Even when Russia suffers a functional defeat in one domain, it will continue to innovate, adapt, and search for alternative ways to regain momentum. Where the Kremlin's strategic persistence ensures that any paralysis is temporary unless actively maintained. For this reason, Ukraine, together with its allies, must not only defend against Russian moves, but continuously shape the operational environment, staying ahead of proactive disruption, not reactive containment. Maintaining the initiative is essential, but you want a static battlefield. That's going to be the problem with initiative. Russia must be the one to adapt, absorb pressure, and defend, not Ukraine. And that's what Russia's trying to do. Is attritional warfare is about pressure. It's about pressure economically, attritionally for people. It's about pressure as far as industry too. And that's where Ukraine needs to apply that pressure, but need to be in a much better attrition rate than what it currently is. And at the moment, if you had asked me of who is then having adaptation on the front and absorbing losses and not being sat in defense, falling back continuously, it is not Ukraine. It is Russia at this point in time. And again, like I said in my conclusions, it comes down to that it's admitting that peace isn't coming anytime soon, that it pretends that there is a strategy while there isn't. It's not a plan to win, it's a plan to survive indefinitely and hope that Russia gives up. And that this isn't victory, it's a slow death with a PR campaign. Saying that it needs to hold it forever, and also that there's going to be never-ending money, manpower, weapons, morale, and assuming that there's no actual breakthroughs either, or that another country, whether it is Germany or France or the US or whoever, says enough is enough, we need to sort our way out of this. So, again, as we've gone over, Russia doesn't need to win in a conventional sense in this either. It just needs to keep Ukraine in a permanent state of instability. And it can be looking at the exact same sort of tactic in this as far as strategic neutralization, that they're going, well, we can just strategically neutralize and take year 2. So again, a lot of people have asked me to go over that, and I hope that sums up enough of my thoughts and conclusion about it. Anyway, Legends, you have a fantastic day. I'm going to go explore Kansas. I have no idea what to expect yet. I just know the driving is wild. Okay, thank you, and I'll speak to you tomorrow. Thank you. Bye-bye.